The Astral Plane Debates, Richard Feynman versus John Lilly. Written by David Christopher Lane. Narrated by Justin M. Grant. The Feynman-Lilly Debate. Question: What is the original sin of humankind? Answer: confusing our neurology for ontology. The human dilemma is that we have an innate tendency to conflate our current brain state with how reality, apart from ourselves, really is, forgetting in the process that our subjective experiences may be inaccurate or misleading representations of our objective surroundings. There are, of course, good evolutionary reasons for why this is the case, since in our struggle for survival we have to rely on our mental maps, and take them seriously, in order to find food, ward or fight off enemies, secure housing, find mates, protect offspring, and so on. But often, our internal projections can be deceiving, especially if our relatively stable waking state gets biochemically altered. Cognitive impairments such as Alzheimer's, dementia, amnesia, bipolar disorder, and fever-induced deliriums dramatically change how we interact and interpret the world around us. We can also consciously manipulate our consciousness by ingesting a variety of drugs, each providing a slightly different lens by which to see ourselves and others. In religion, there is a long history of individuals who have had inner visions and inspirations that they have taken to be revelations from God or a higher power, and have created their own unique movements on the basis of it. That such mystical encounters may be only byproducts of their own minds, and have nothing to do with angels or divine beings doesn't arise, since its evidential reality is too overwhelming to doubt. What we confront here is a perennial conundrum. Given that mystical experiences are plentiful, and that our brains seem almost universally wired for them, the outstanding question that remains is one of explanation. How do we best interpret and adjudicate these apparently transcendental excursions? And how? Scientific Friends Who Disagree. Richard Feynman and John Lilly. Richard Feynman, 1918 to 1988, is well known and well regarded for his contributions to quantum electrodynamics, or QED, for which he won a Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965, along with Shinichiro Tomonaga and Julian Schwinger. But what may come as a surprise to those not conversant with his life and work is that Richard Feynman was also deeply interested in out-of-body experiences and became adept at it after becoming acquainted with John Lilly, 1915 to 2001, a pioneer in the field of Dolphin research who had developed sensory deprivation tanks in the 1950s. Despite becoming friends, Feynman and Lilly parted company with each other over how best to interpret inner experiences while out of the body. Feynman argued that all such phenomena were hallucinatory in nature, whereas Lilly felt that they revealed something far beyond the rational mind and the restrictive limits of empirical science. Richard Feynman recalls how he first met John Lilly. I used to give a lecture every Wednesday over at Hughes Aircraft Company, and one day I got there a little ahead of time and was flirting around with the receptionist as usual, when about half a dozen people came in, a man, a woman, and a few others. I'd never seen them before. The man said, "Is this where Professor Feynman is giving some lectures?" "This is the place," the receptionist replied. The man asks if this group can come to the lectures. "I don't think you'd like 'em much," I say. "They're kind of technical." Pretty soon the woman, who was rather clever, figured it out. "I bet you're Professor Feynman." It turned out the man was John Lilly, who had earlier done some work with dolphins. He and his wife were doing some research into sense deprivation and had built some tanks. "Isn't it true that you're supposed to get hallucinations under those circumstances?" I asked, excitedly. "That is true indeed." I had always had this fascination with the images from dreams and other images that come to the mind that haven't got a direct sensory source, and how it works in the head, and I wanted to see hallucinations. I had once thought to take drugs, but I got kind of scared of that. I love to think, and I don't want to screw up the machine. But it seemed to me that just lying around in a sense deprivation tank had no physiological danger, so I was very anxious to try it. I quickly accepted the Lilly's invitation to use the tanks, a very kind invitation on their part, and they came to listen to the lecture with their group. While Feynman took up Lilly's offer, he resisted the mystical overlay that surrounded the deprivation tank hoopla, calling such mystic hokey-poke, wick-wack things, and most curiously, all kinds of gorp. Yet, Feynman found his experiences deeply fascinating and enriching, despite his skeptical interpretations. With repeated sessions in the saltwater tank, he became adept at leaving his body and experiencing all sorts of intriguing phenomena. As Feynman recounts, I had many types of out-of-the-body experiences. Nature isn't classical, damn it, and if you want to make a simulation of nature, you'd better make it quantum mechanical. Richard Feynman. One time, for example, I could see the back of my head with my hands resting against it. When I moved my fingers, I saw them move, but between the fingers and the thumb, I saw the blue sky. Of course, that wasn't right. It was a hallucination. But the point is that as I moved my fingers, their movement was exactly consistent with the motion that I was imagining that I was seeing. The entire imagery would appear and be consistent with what you feel and are doing, much like when you slowly wake up in the morning and are touching something and you don't know what it is, and suddenly it becomes clear what it is. So the entire imagery would suddenly appear, except it's unusual in the sense that you usually would imagine the ego to be located in the front of the back of the head, but instead you have it behind the back of the head. Throughout it all, Feynman remains the scientific skeptic, even as he becomes increasingly disoriented by what occurs while experiencing an OBE. He also continually attempts to differentiate what is happening from mere dreaming. Feynman elaborates. One of the things that perpetually bothered me psychologically while I was having a hallucination was that I might have fallen asleep and would therefore be only dreaming. I had already had some experience with dreams, and I wanted a new experience. It was kind of dopey, because when you're having hallucinations and things like that, you're not very sharp. So you do these dumb things that you set your mind to do, such as checking that you're not dreaming. So, I perpetually was checking that I wasn't dreaming by, since my hands were often behind my head, rubbing my thumbs together back and forth, feeling them. Of course, I could have been dreaming that, but I wasn't. I knew it was real. After the very beginning, when the excitement of having a hallucination made them jump out or stop happening, I was able to relax and have long hallucinations. Notice that Feynman never actually believes that his experiences are anything more than fantastic, even if extraordinarily lucid hallucinations, a word he uses repeatedly when describing his exteriorizations. Because of this dismissive attitude, Lilly reprimanded Feynman in a letter and accused him of being non-scientific. Interestingly, when John Lilly had mystical experiences of what he perceived as otherworldly beings in his sensory deprivation tank, after taking mind-altering drugs such as ketamine, he argued strongly for their ontological objectivity. Whereas Richard Feynman, who had similar experiences as Lilly, they were friends, labeled his out-of-body excursions as hallucinations. Feynman's categorical dismissal miffed Lilly, who then criticized him in a personal letter with the terse rebuttal, "You stopped being a scientist the instant you said that word, hallucination." Feynman countered Lilly's assertion by pointing out that whatever out-of-body experiences he was having, and Feynman recalls becoming very good at it, didn't correlate to the outside world. Even when undergoing the dissociation, he thought they did. It was for this reason that he tried to convince Lilly that the imagination that things are real does not represent true reality. If you see golden globes or something several times, and they talk to you during your hallucination and tell you they are another intelligence, it doesn't mean they're another intelligence. It just means that you have had this particular hallucination. I believe there's nothing in hallucinations that has anything to do with anything external to the internal psychological state of the person who's got the hallucination. Feynman's critique of Lilly, as outlined above, can be codified in just one of his sentences when he writes, "If you see Golden Globes or something several times, and they talk to you during your hallucination and tell you they are another intelligence, it doesn't mean they're another intelligence. It just means that you have had this particular hallucination." Feynman's skepticism may cause disbelieving cackles among those who believe that what is experienced while having an OBE is something more than phantasmagoria. Yet, could Feynman's hallucinatory hypothesis hold true for religious visions in general? This got me to thinking of how a visionary mystic such as Sri Ramakrishna would respond to someone like Feynman, since the Bengali saint had visions weekly, if not daily, during his lifetime. As the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna retells the story, but he did not have to wait very long. He has thus described his first vision of the mother. "I felt as if my heart were being squeezed like a wet towel. I was overpowered with a great restlessness and a fear that it might not be my lot to realize her in this life. I could not bear the separation from her any longer. Life seemed to be not worth living. Suddenly my glance fell on the sword that was kept in the mother's temple. I determined to put an end to my life. When I jumped up like a madman and seized it, suddenly the Blessed Mother revealed herself. The buildings with their different parts, the temple, and everything else vanished from my sight, leaving no trace whatsoever, and in their stead I saw a limitless, infinite, effulgent ocean of consciousness, as far as the eye could see. The shining billows were madly rushing at me from all sides with a terrific noise to swallow me up. I was panting for breath. I was caught in the rush and collapsed, unconscious. What was happening in the outside world I did not know, but within me there was a steady flow of undiluted bliss, altogether new, and I felt the presence of the Divine Mother. On his lips, when he regained consciousness of the world, was the word, Mother. Would the latest findings in neuroscience disabuse Ramakrishna of spiritual ecstasies? Since manifestations of Kali, the Divine Mother, were actually the result of his undiagnosed temporal lobe epilepsy and not divine revelations, as he so ardently believed? Or is such undiagnosed medical reductionism going too far? It is one of those curious coincidences that prop up now and then when studying the lives of great men and women, that the year Sri Ramakrishna died, 1886, is the same year that another intense visionary in India, Baba Fakir Chand, 1886 to 1981, was born. While Ramakrishna died when he was only 50 years old, Fakir lived until he was 95. Yet what they both had in common was the remarkable ability to have spiritual visions almost at will. The fundamental difference, however, is that Fakir came to believe that all such experiences were projections of his own mind, and were in themselves illusory. He, like Feynman, didn't think such images were real. As Fakir explains in his revealing book, The Secret of Secrets, "My form manifests in America, Africa, and in different parts of India, but I remain unaware of the persons who meditate on my form. I have removed this mask of fancy, whereas some other gurus and religious heads take undue advantage of this myth from their ignorant followers. I do not blame the religious heads and these gurus, because the followers, too, feel flattered by this loot, and they do not want to get rid of this illusion. Key researchers such as John Lilly and Terence McKenna have long argued that dismissing inner experiences, whether by ingesting psychedelics or by meditation, as mere hallucinations misses the larger issue and prematurely downplays their potential significance. As McKenna argues, all these themes are woven around DMT, possibly because DMT creates a microcosm of this very shift of epochs in the experience of a single individual. It seems to lift the perceiving mind out of the confines of ordinary space and time, and give a glimpse of the largest frame of being possible. When Plato remarked that time is the moving image of eternity, he made a statement every voyage into the DMT space reinforces. Like the shift of epoch called the apocalypse, and anticipated by religious hysterics, DMT seems to illuminate the regions beyond death. And what is the dimension beyond life as illuminated by DMT? If we can trust our own perceptions, then it is a place in which thrives an ecology of souls, whose stuff of being is more syntactical than material. It seems to be a nearby realm, inhabited by eternal elfin entelechies made entirely of information and joyous self-expression. The afterlife is more Celtic fairyland than existential nonentity. At least, that is the evidence of the DMT experience. The problem with Feynman's categorical "it's all hallucinations" hypothesis is that it lacks nuance and can in itself prevent one from further exploring the borderlands of the mind. Even though Fakir eventually felt that all inner visions were illusory, he still persisted in meditating, since he found that he could have experiences beyond light and sound. Yet, what caught Feynman's attention most was that his visions were invariably intertwined with what he had been thinking about previously. He also argued that we shouldn't confuse our imaginary voyages with reality. Apparently, in his discussions with Lilly, he didn't persuade him to his side, try as he might. Recalls Feynman, "One of the questions I thought about was whether hallucinations, like dreams, are influenced by what you already have in your mind, from other experiences during the day or before, or from things you are expecting to see. The reason, I believe, that I had an out-of-body experience was that we were discussing out-of-body experiences just before I went into the tank. And the reason I had a hallucination about how memories are stored in the brain was, I think, that I had been thinking about that problem all week. I had considerable discussion with the various people there about the reality of experiences." They argued that something is considered real in experimental science if the experience can be reproduced. Thus, when many people see golden globes that talk to them time after time, the globes must be real. My claim was that in such situations there was a bit of discussion previous to going into the tank about the golden globes. So when the person hallucinating, with his mind already thinking about golden globes when he went into the tank, sees some approximation of the globes, maybe they're blue or something, he thinks he's reproducing the experience. Fakir would agree with Feynman that religious visions are the product of previously undigested experiences we have in the waking state, which get astrally magnified when we alter our state of consciousness. For instance, Fakir once had a most remarkable vision of his eventual guru, Maharishi Shivbrat Lal, before ever meeting him. In his vision, he even received the correct address to his guru's ashram and began writing him monthly. Initially, Fakir was convinced that this extraordinary experience was a miracle, since he saw and learned things that were completely new to him. However, years later, Fakir thought more deeply about the subject and came to believe that he must have come upon Shivbrat Lal's picture and address days or weeks before his visions, and unconsciously incorporated such into his startling religious perception. Fakir's explanation actually makes sense in light of the fact that Shivbrat Lal was a prolific writer and had published a number of books and magazines that were widely circulated. Sam Harris, the noted author and neuroscientist, severely critiqued Dr. Eben Alexander for alleging that he had proof that heaven exists because he had a near-death experience that convinced him of it. As Alexander vividly describes it, as cited by Harris in his article, This Must Be Heaven, "I was a speck on a beautiful butterfly wing, millions of other butterflies around us. We were flying through blooming flowers, blossoms on trees, and they were all coming out as we flew through them. There were waterfalls, pools of water, indescribable colors, and above there were these arcs of silver and gold light and beautiful hymns coming down from them. Indescribably gorgeous hymns. I later came to call them angels, those arcs of light in the sky. I think that word is probably fairly accurate. Then we went out of this universe. I remember just seeing everything receding, and initially I felt as if my awareness was in an infinite black void. It was very comforting, but I could feel the extent of the infinity and that it was, as you would expect, impossible to put into words. I was there with that divine presence that was not anything that I could visibly see and describe, and with a brilliant orb of light. They said there were many things that they would show me, and they continued to do that. In fact, the whole higher dimensional multiverse was this incredibly complex corrugated ball, and all these lessons coming into me about it. To wit, Harris then goes on to cite Terence McKenna's own experience under DMT, pointing out the obvious similarities between the two, and suggesting that Alexander has confused a neurological state for an ontological one. Writes Harris, Alexander believes that his E. coli-addled brain could not have produced his visions because they were too intense, too hyper-real, too beautiful, too interactive, and too drenched in significance for even a healthy brain to conjure. He also appears to think that, despite their timeless quality, his visions could not have arisen in the minutes or hours during which his cortex, which surely never went off, switched back on. He clearly knows nothing about what people with working brains experience under the influence of psychedelics. Nor does he know that visions of the sort that McKenna describes, although they may seem to last for ages, require only a brief span of biological time. Unlike LSD and other long-acting psychedelics, DMT alters consciousness for merely a few minutes. Alexander would have had more than enough time to experience a visionary ecstasy as he was coming out of his coma, whether his cortex was rebooting or not. Does Alexander know that DMT already exists in the brain as a neurotransmitter? Did his brain experience a surge of DMT release during his coma? This is pure speculation, of course, but it is a far more credible hypothesis than that his cortex shut down, freeing his soul to travel to another dimension. As one of his correspondents has already informed him, similar experiences can be had with ketamine, which is a surgical anesthetic that is occasionally used to protect a traumatized brain. The brain is a filtering mechanism, and whenever certain chemicals, such as LSD, are taken within the body, it completely alters the cerebral symphony. There is no denying that humans have the capacity for extraordinary states of consciousness, regardless of how they are generated. But the contentious issue that keeps bubbling forth and which doesn't disappear is always a translative one. How best to arbitrate the extraordinary occurrence? Even though I tend to align myself with a more skeptical attitude to all such inner phenomena, sometimes the reductionistic approach can border on the inane, as what happened when Carl Sagan in Broca's Brain, where he tried to reduce near-death experiences to vague birth memories of coma of one's obstetrician, apparently forgetting in the process that those undergoing caesarean birth report the same kind of NDEs as those born vaginally. Yes, intertheoretic reductionism can on occasion go too far and end up providing us with less, not more, information about a significant event. While I applaud Feynman's skepticism, he was willing to do the experiment and willing to listen to contrarian ideas, lumping each and every OBE as a hallucination, even if somewhat accurate, can be misleading, especially since much valuable data can be garnered within such states about how consciousness works when deprived of incoming stimuli from the five senses. Lest we forget, our current waking state is also the direct result of our neural symphony, and though augmented by varying data streams, light, sound, touch, smell, etc., it too has hallucinatory features, as has been repeatedly documented in various studies on visual perception. As for myself, I have noticed that deep meditation can reveal aspects of the mind that cannot be so readily garnered in a purely eyes-open, waking state. While such numinous encounters may tell me nothing about the world outside of my head, they do tell me much about how our consciousness works as a virtual simulator, and how what we see and hear within can take on overwhelming certainty of its own. Perhaps the real danger is when we conflate our OBEs and NDEs with external realities, neglecting in the process that they may be distinct realms that needn't overlap, at least not epistemologically. I have often stressed in my college and university courses that the original sin of humankind wasn't necessarily taking a bite of the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, but rather when we mistakenly believed that our present, past, or future neural state actually revealed the real state of the universe. We are knowledge-bounded creatures who, for evolutionary reasons, have taken whatever current state we are in, as partial as it may be, as something whole and correct, and because of this are caught within magical worlds of our own making, where image becomes reality, and where effect becomes cause. I am not quite sure how we can get beyond this brain-generated impasse, except to realize that in the library of consciousness there are a multitude of potential states of awareness. All we have to do is open our mind to them, and be sure not to exaggerate their reach. The hypnagogic state. It is easy to have visions when one is meditating, providing one hasn't slept for a couple of days. Hypnagogia, which is usually defined as the transitional state to and from sleep, can induce all sorts of fantastic apparitions and strange admixtures of light and sound. However, how one ultimately interprets these passing phantasms seems to be directly correlated with theoretic prefiguring. John Lilly, who was famous for his pioneering studies on how consciousness behaves when deprived of incoming stimuli, came to realize that preset modeling played a transformative role in how one ultimately viewed inner experiences, whether induced by spiritual practices or hallucinogenics. His findings indicated that there was an almost intractable problem confronting the scientific study of the mind because your theories or explanations will determine which experiences you will or will not have, no matter what experiments you perform. It is difficult to test a theory in this realm if other beliefs limit the range of available experiences. Set and setting is elemental. It is important to realize the plasticity of the mind and how easy it is for a different setting to alter and transform an experience, whether by drugs or by meditation. For instance, on occasion when I meditate at night and I haven't had sufficient sleep, I have very lucid visions of all sorts of phenomena. They appear just as real as anything I witness in the waking state, but these experiences are transpiring with my eyes completely closed. Once I saw a wonderful cascading shower of rain, filled with different colors, and it literally felt as if water drops were bathing my face. Phenomenologically speaking, I would be hard-pressed to differentiate this hypnagogic state from my normal waking state awareness. Yet I am quite familiar with visual hallucinations, and thus I don't take such liquid displays too seriously, and I certainly don't give them any special meaning. However, and here is where Lilly's understanding of theoretic prefiguring looms large, if I followed or believed in a different paradigm which took such lucidities as signposts of a higher spirituality, such as with a Kankar or MSIA, which places a high value on lucid dreaming, I would most likely interpret such phantasms in a more positive and significant light. For John Lilly provides us with a telling example, as recounted in his autobiography. In profound isolation, one may have the experience that other people are present, or that one is receiving communications from sources outside the tank. What one makes of these experiences depends on one's beliefs. A person who believes in telepathy is likely to conclude that the messages are actually coming from someone or something at a distance from the tank. Within such a belief system, the experience will be perceived as real. On the other hand, yet, someone who does not believe in telepathy having the same basic experience will perceive the experience as unreal, perhaps calling it an hallucination. Interestingly, when John Lilly had mystical experiences of what he perceived as otherworldly beings in his sensory deprivation tank, after taking mind-altering drugs like ketamine, he argued strongly for their ontological objectivity. Yet Buddhist literature provides a more skeptical viewpoint, as outlined in the Bardo Todal, or more famously known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which also describes the illusory nature of such inner encounters. Evans Wentz summarizes the Buddhist viewpoint thusly: that all phenomena are transitory, are illusionary, are unreal, and non-existent, save in the samsaric mind perceiving them. That in reality there are no such beings anywhere as gods or demons or spirits or sentient creatures, all alike being phenomena dependent upon a cause. That this cause is a yearning or a thirsting after sensation, after the unstable samsaric existence. John Lilly countered cynics by arguing that the word hallucination is a trash bin concept for a whole range of experiences that people wish to discount because they are unconventional or difficult to describe. The term is an unscientific generalization that confuses a multitude of significant processes and specific experiences involving internal reality. This apparently indissoluble impasse, mysticism versus neurology or superluminal versus mundane, has implications that are more far-reaching and paradoxical than one might at first suspect. A pregnant illustration of this is how a limited purview can actually tripwire an erstwhile rationalist into believing something contrary to their usual common sense. As Lilly explains, a behaviorist, usually the most skeptical and hard-boiled sort of psychologist, might enter the deprivation tank with the belief that nothing can happen in the brain without some external stimulus as the cause. Should an experience occur which appears to come from a source outside his own head, but with no such possible source nearby, such a person might then be forced to adopt a belief in telepathy in order to explain it. Within the belief system of the behaviorist, this becomes the only acceptable explanation for such phenomena, in a framework that does not allow for any inner experience or even hallucinations. Paradoxically, then, a person who does not even believe in the psyche may end up believing in psychic communication. What is so unusual about this theoretic prefiguring is that if it is not closely guarded and checked, it can have devastating personal and political consequences, such that a relatively normal and sane person could be diagnosed as psychotic, not because of their experiences per se, but by not proffering the politically correct map by which to adjudicate it. As Lilly insightfully foretells, any normal, healthy person could have unusual experiences that would seem real if they believed in them. But if he did not believe in them, the experiences would seem unreal. In either case, the experience is the same, but the interpretative model is different in each. If, however, such a person believes in the reality of the experience and communicates this belief to a psychiatrist, the psychiatrist would conclude that the individual was hallucinating and might be psychotic. However, on the other end of the spectrum, as Lilly points out, if the patient describes an unusual experience and professes not to believe in its reality, then this same psychiatrist might be less inclined to assume mental pathology. Context determines content. Our preset notions, or mental maps, can predetermine how we ultimately interpret our inner experiences. This then leads us to a most unusual neural paradox, wherein one is not judged by the experience itself, but rather by one's beliefs or opinions about his experience. Yet in most cases, these sets of beliefs, or more properly worldviews, were already in place before one had any inner experiences whatsoever. Lilly soon realized, after his fantastical encounters of other beings in other universes, frighteningly retold in his classic book, The Center of the Cyclone, that how one recounted the experience, as a believer in their reality or as merely an unreal hallucination, made all the difference in how the outside listener judged his relative sanity. More importantly, however, was how one personally regarded such experiences, since some inner journeys were so utterly horrific that those who saw them as merely hallucinatory night terrors could liquidate their gnawing fears by recognizing their dreamlike and unreal nature. But others who firmly believed in such excursions could be caught in a hellish nightmare from which it appeared impossible to escape. As Lilly astutely summarized, such explanations and theories are really beliefs about the universe and the mind. A particular belief may or may not be true, may or may not cause one to act in a certain way, but that belief will unquestionably set limits on what one can experience. How then can a science of consciousness proceed, if at the very outset our neural prefiguring already contours our eventual adventures of the mind? John Lilly's answer to that query has now become his most cited philosophical witticism. In the province of the mind, what is believed to be true is true or becomes true, within certain limits to be found experientially and experimentally. These limits are further beliefs, to be transcended. In the province of the mind, there are no limits. In other words, if consciousness is a virtual simulator, then it can potentially simulate anything, given the necessary information. The glitch here, however, is that a simulating brain is invariably bounded by what it believes to be possible, particularly in a society which by its very structure tends to limit what can be plausibly accepted at any one particular point in time and space. Breaking through such psychological and cultural boundary lines is, of course, a daunting task, since such breaking of taboo makes one a potential outcast. It is also dangerous, since there is a fine line between acting as if something may be real versus acting as if something is indeed real. Richard Feynman cautioned his would-be scientists at Caltech on their graduation day that the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. While this is certainly helpful advice, the problem is that our brains were designed to trick us from the very start, since every experience we have of the world, both within and without, isn't, as Kant pointed out centuries prior, the thing in itself, but rather the end result of a filtering process which invariably colors whatever we see and hear and touch around us. The recognition that the mind is a simulator par excellence doesn't liberate us from its unceasing simulations, since even that recognition is part and parcel a simulation as well. We are living in a neural paradox, which may be likened to an endless hall of mirrors, where what we think we recognize as real and substantive may on closer inspection be merely an image of an image of an image, ad infinitum.